Good evening. Thank you all for coming. My name is Nick Acquavella. I'm here on behalf of Acquavella Galleries. Really, this is the first step in the beginning of this kind of exhibition and this idea that about a year ago, the Glimcher family and my family thought about this Miró Calder Constellation show and how we were both in a unique position to perhaps pull something off like this, and to be standing here now in this, great setting here at the Morgan Library, having just left the gallery where all the constellations are hanging, knowing what's down at Pace, it's a really exciting moment certainly for the Acquavella family, and I think also for the Glimcher family. Just want to thank you all for coming out tonight. It's going to be a very interesting conversation, and I'm going to turn it over to Mark, who's going to tell you a little bit about our speakers tonight. And thank you again, and also I hope all of you get the opportunity to come see the two shows, because it's really going to be a special occasion to get to see all these works in what is a 20-block radius. Thank you.
Good evening. Good evening, everybody. My name is Mark Glimcher from Pace Gallery. Thank you, Nick. Thank you, Acquavella family. We both had a chance to see our own shows, and we're going to see each other's tomorrow. It is really a staggering thing to see these works come together, and we have to thank so many lenders, which we will be doing tomorrow night and for many weeks to come. So many generous people, but there's some amazing time period that we're able to see through this incredible lens of these two artists, their relationship with each other, and how they responded to one of the most desperate times in history in an incredibly inspiring way. And it is a very powerful thing. And we're very fortunate to have Joan Miró and Sandy Rower, the director of the Succession Miró, director of the Calder Foundation, together with Dr. Mendelson, to discuss this incredible sort of story. So thank you all very much for coming. Thank you to our panel. Come on up. Come on up.
As you've just heard, we're celebrating this conversation on the occasion of the two exhibitions opening tomorrow, a really unique opportunity to see Calder and Miró's Constellations in paired exhibitions over the next 5 to 6 weeks. So again, I'd encourage everyone to look at the works in person. We have some on display in this PowerPoint that we'll be looking at, but I want to really celebrate the occasion of having Sandy and Joan here together tonight to talk about their grandfather's work. In my own work as a scholar, I have relied upon their generosity and scholarship for several years, and it's difficult to emphasize enough how important it is, the kind of work that both Sandy and Joan have done, most importantly for their grandfather's work and legacy, but also in support of scholars and artists and writers who engage with their grandfather's work. These are two of the most generous directors of foundations and museums that I have worked with. We wanted to, over the course of the next 30 to 40 minutes, talk about the artists' work, their relationship together, the evolution in their work over the time that they knew each other, and then we're going to land on, for a little bit, the works that are most relevant to the exhibitions, which is the Constellation series. And I asked Sandy and Joan if we could start really at kind of the beginning of their grandfather's relationship together, which, as you can see on the screen, is a letter written by Calder to Miró, kind of invitation card. And I'm wondering, Sandy, would you want to start us off by talking a little bit about about those first moments in his work and the impact that Miró made on him?
Well, it really began with a very attractive lady.
As As most stories do.
It's true. As you can all see up there, this mention of this woman, Wendy Babe Hawes, who was a fashion designer. She wrote a book called Life is Spinach about her life and her exploits and so forth. And my grandfather knew her in New York, and he made some jewelry for her, including stuff that went on her fashion, closures and buttons and various things. That's now in the collection at the Met at the Fashion Institute. All of her material is there. So Wendy Babe was this really exotic bohemian lady who did all kinds of groovy stuff and was friends with Miró and suggested that the next trip Calder made back to Europe, back to Paris, that he look Miró up. And so he wrote this letter of introduction, which is really self-explanatory.
Our families have known each other for the last almost 90 years, Sandy. Almost. Which is a long way. Thank you.
Do you, Joan, I mean, I know that you spent a lot of time also in your grandfather's studio, and you were young then, of course. 10-year-olds don't usually ask precocious questions like, how about that guy, Sandy? But in the research that you've done around those early meetings between, your grandfather and Sandy's grandfather, what have you learned about those early moments of their relationship together? Was it more of a kind of personal affection? Do you feel like that from the start they appreciated each other's work and working method, or?
The story that I really pull out of the research that I've done on Joan Miró and Sandy Calder friendship is one of the most beautiful stories I ever heard about of great masters of the 20th century. Because when I was putting a show together for the Miró Foundation in Barcelona 20 years ago on Calder, I spoke with Sean Sweeney, James Johnson Sweeney's son, and he said, Sandy was so tall, so strong, always with jeans, with his red shirt, outspoken, and Miró was so committed, so shy, very well dressed with his suit, and always very quiet. But when you see them together, there was magic happening. And I said, but why it was such a special thing? I said, Joan, explaining what I was feeling with Sandy Calder and Joan Miró next to me goes beyond my imagination. But the only thing I could really say is that they were soulmates. And that's the right word to describe how your grandfather and my grandfather got along so well to the end of their lives.
If you don't mind, I'm going to speed to recent history for a second.
Yes, please do.
So everyone thinks that Joan and I have known each other all our lives because our grandfathers were best friends, and his mother was a friend of my mother. But when I started the foundation, so he grew up in Mallorca, and I grew up in New York. We had no association really, and I used to write his mother a letter, and she would never reply. I'd write a letter, never reply. I'd write a letter, never reply. I'd write a letter, never reply. And finally, I went to Mallorca after we met, right? I went to Mallorca, and his mom said, oh yes, I have all your letters. They're like all stacked up, all these letters, never reply. So he was a student at NYU, and he was doing an internship at a gallery, and his first day interning of a gallery I won't mention, he saw a letter from me to the gallery on my letterhead, and he grabbed it. He went to the photocopy machine, he made a copy of it, he put the letter back, he took the paper. That was his one-day internship. He left, he never went back. And he called me up, and he said, hi, my name's Joan. And then we got together, we had dinner, and we've been really incredibly close friends ever since. We're both a lot older now, but... and then shortly after, he had surgery in New York. It was an amazing experience. So he had heart surgery in New York. I went to see him the morning after, and he had staples all down his chest and his belly, like a zipper, where they had replaced his heart valve. So that locomotive we were hearing is his valve. It's really amazing. It's incredible that he's alive. So, now we can go back.
Let me hear that. I can't follow that. Could you help me from the booth in advance? For some reason, I'm not able to advance. Perfect. So following up on this, the long-standing friendship, and also, as usual, described it, that these are two individuals who, from the outside, don't look as if they would be compatible, right? I mean, different personalities. And yet, when I think about their work, there are two qualities about both artists that always strike me as just the value of the artist in their work. And I would say one is the work ethic. And you described, observing that, your grandfather's working 24/7, just never stopped working, thinking. And I think when we've spoken about your grandfather, whether it was fixing the plumbing, but the fix looked like a piece of artwork, or just the constant engagement with life, too, as an artistic project. And in that regard, I see these two artists as having this incredible life force around their art-making progress, where it was never shut off. It was always on. And the other quality is craftsmanship. And when I think about each of their individual works and the way that they engage in materials, the craft of working with the materials is exemplary in both artists' work. And from their work and craft come so many amazing ideas. So I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit more to kind of beyond the surface, which are these anecdotes that everyone really likes to hear because they illustrate so much about their vitality, but also the serious work of art that I feel like both artists engage with from their earliest moments on. And if that wasn't also something of a shared commitment to the labor involved in art making as a serious endeavor.
I think that in this photo, we can see my grandfather in Paris in 1932, and that's when he spoke to the assassination of painting to Thériault. He was saying that the art has been in decadence since the age of cavemen. That was a very straightforward statement against classicism. And what happened is that both Calder and Miró were groundbreaking pioneers. There are two things that I always recall when I see Sandy's work and my grandfather's work, is that they hated repetition and they hated to be predictable. That's the magic key, plus the great engineering process that Sandy Calder had as engineering with his fantastic machines and motors and rotors. And Grandpa's anecdote that I can tell today to all of you since we speak about Constellations is that I had the chance to be in Grandpa's studio when I was only 10 years old. He was 85. And there was a piece of a work, an oil work on wood that is said 1944, and then crossed out and said Femme et oiseau, 16 April 1974, après les constellations. So today in America we have this amazing exhibition of Miró and Calder constellations from 41 and 43, but it's quite interesting the craftsmanship that Jordana was saying before, that he was able to keep for 40 years. A work began in the 40s in the studio in Barcelona or in Mallorca, bring back to the tables and rework it over again 40 years ago. And what happened too is about the beautiful process of creation that my grandfather used to follow in Mallorca, which was to put on the court cardboards and boards and wood on the rain, on the sun, on the humidity, and after a month, since all they are like living, undulating forms, he was just being seduced by the force of the intuition, accident, chance, and all those different things were suggesting new forms to follow in creation.
Wow. So that's Miró 1932, and that's Calder 1931. Look at the faces of these guys. So we've all been brainwashed that these are childlike, lyric men, which is so annoying because if you look at their faces, they're kind of pissed off guys. And if you knew Calder at all, you knew that he was very serious. Now, I knew his grandfather a bit when I was a boy. He was a serious, scary guy. He was not this little nymph running in the woods, you know, this kind of idiotic image, right? Both of these guys were fearsome characters. You would never want to cross them. I'm not addressing the their splendid ability at creation, as you were asking, but the pictures remind me that the seriousness of both of them is something that gets glossed over, that reductionist kind of vision of these two guys that use bright colors and of movement, implied movement, actual movement. It's just, I fight that kind of reduction every day. My staff, I have 18 people that work at the foundation. They fight the stupidity of reduction every single day. And it's great to see them together because I've never actually seen this juxtaposition of these two pictures together, within a year of each other. And they, they're not happy.
Yeah. Well, I think to follow up, because actually what we might agree on is a mischaracterization, right, of both artists as playful, ludic, a lot of that written into the post-work art criticism, right? Really trying to operate on a strictly formal plane, which I think we could all agree there's lots going on in form that we could talk about, but also a kind of, sucking what is oftentimes the life out of the work that they did, because not only, as you've pointed out, are they serious at work, but they also had very serious commitments, which hopefully we can get to in a minute. But I wanted to follow up on this question about process, because and since you brought up the constellations, the process, right, that Calder initiated this series was to destroy one of his pieces, right, from 1929, and you talk a lot about Miró kind of creatively adding, but also he also is a destroyer of his own work in the pursuit of making new work, whether it's lighting it on fire, ripping it apart. There's a real process that both artists engage in which their own work is not sacrosanct, but part of the creative process. And I think that seriousness, and we can call it play, but it's a really serious play. And I think play often diminishes that what they're engaging in is a fierce engagement with their materials and their work, but one in which does not disallow them from destroying their own work to make new work. And I'm wondering if you could, since Joan talked a little bit about the one constellation piece, if you could talk a little bit about some of these stories about how your grandfather started to make some of these constellation works, which in their finished versions are so elegant and well crafted that it's really hard to remember that they begin with this initial kind of act of destruction.
Well, so in my family, play is a four-letter word because it implies a lack of rigor.
Yeah.
And it's taken some smart people, including this Joost Elfers here in the front row, to get me to learn that play actually is the process of innovation.
Yeah.
And so if we think about a child learning how to stack blocks, they do it 3 times, and then they get better at it, and then they do it 9 times, and they can stack it, higher, et cetera. And that whole process becomes a dynamic force, right? It's exponential. A child grows and learns. And both of our grandfathers used play in that same way. They would approach a question, which is a form or a color, and then apply it, and then expand upon it. Mm-hmm. So in my grandfather's case, Jordana is referring to the Constellations began during the war when Calder stopped using sheet aluminum because it was needed to fight Hitler. Sheet aluminum was used in airplanes and bombs, and it was a really sought-after material. I mean, people would take their aluminum pots and pans and turn them over to be recycled into sheet metal for airplanes and bombs. So Calder stopped using aluminum. He could still get it. It was rarer, but he could still get it. But he decided to go back to wood carving, which he had done at different periods in his life. And his process is quite interesting, and we know it because there are still some of the elements of the Constellation series left over in the Calder studio in Connecticut, and they're actually in the catalog that you'll all see eventually in a few weeks. The end papers of the Calder volume are those leftover elements. So he would take a piece of wood, kind of precious wood, carve it, rasp it, scrape it, polish it, but not completely finish it, leaving it raw, leaving it finished and unfinished at the same time, and make a series of those objects, like 50 of them, or maybe more. And then when each one was complete, as a complete object, he would stitch them together with wire and create those pressurized collages that are intended to hang at unexpected moments. So Calder realized that there's this whole space in a gallery or in a home above paintings, this unutilized space. So he made sculptures to hang above the paintings, to grab that space. So you think about a mobile hanging in space, these constellations are supposed to, in a similar way, take charge of a place that no one thought of occupying.
That's really interesting, the whole idea of occupying as kind of space. We were talking about seriousness of commitments, and I think this is something that would be important for us to talk about, since a lot of the criticism, right, around Miró and Calder does focus on what I think a lot of art historians consider a kind of formal autonomy in the work, that these are artists who maintained an integrity to experimentation and form. And I think, unfortunately, a result of some of that criticism is that we forget that these were also artists who were deeply socially and politically engaged. And I'm wondering if we can, so what you're looking at here are two pictures from the 1937 pavilion, for which Calder made the Mercury Fountain, which you can see at the Miró Foundation in Barcelona, and Miró made the Reaper, which was painted on Celotex tile on the pavilion. So that has been destroyed. But you can see that both artists were in the pavilion, which was held in Paris in 1937. And that fair is most famous for the standoff between the German and the French pavilions, and between the German, and the Russian pavilions. And just under the Russian pavilion was the Spanish Republic's pavilion, which was co-designed by Giuseppe Luis Sert and Luis Lacasa, and it was praised as having a more humanistic scale. And most famously, in the trio of artists that were Miró, Calder, was also Picasso's Guernica, was in the patio of the pavilion, along with many, many other artists.
I have to go to kiss a lady. This is Diana Picasso,
Ah, very nice.
Picasso's granddaughter, and I cannot say anything without that beautiful, beautiful Guernica. And also, I'm gonna kiss Rosa Maria Malet, the director of the Miró Foundation, because when Sandy's grandfather gave the Mercury Fountain to the Miró Foundation in Barcelona, we have it running with water, but it was a problem. You know what happened? That back in this photo, in 1937, all the French kids were getting the coin and they were throwing the coin on the Mercury. And the coins were floating around the Mercury fountain. Say, holy cow, what is going on? And Rosa Maria said, I will not stop until I get this masterpiece of Sandy Calder running with Mercury in Barcelona. And she did. So thank you, Rosa Maria. That was fantastic.
So do you want to talk about this?
Yeah.
Yeah, so let's talk a little bit, because I think that question of political commitment is, and it came up, I think, even last year, right at the Object Symposium, was the question of, how could an artist be politically committed if either their work doesn't look realistic or they're not on a grandstand. And in the case of both of these artists, and you commented about the coins going into the fountain, which raised a tremendous amount of money for Republican children who were in colonies, and Miró's work also raised tremendous funds for the Republic during the war.
Yeah, what happened was that my grandpa was pushed into exile with grandma and my mother that was only 7 years old. They were all in Paris. And with the photo we saw before, they were staying at the beach at Normandy, and my mother was just a little kid with Luisa and Sandy and Pilar and Joan. So that was an amazing photo from 1937, but the tragedy that was just shaking the grounds of apocalypse in Spain were just one of the most horrible periods of my country. It was so painful. But the 3 years of the Spanish Civil War were nothing compared to Franco's repression that lasted 30 years. And this moment, for me, is the peak of history that fights against fascism and fights against communism. And as Jordana was saying, I think that this is something that we really have to highlight. Because when I speak about my grandfather as an artist, is one thing. When I speak about my grandfather as a grandfather, is another thing. But when I think about speaking about Miró as a human being engaged with politics, is a radical history that also has to be highlighted, because when he suffered so much and he saw so much pain throughout so many years with the Spanish Civil War and the Second World War, he made it through and nobody got killed, nobody got shot up, and they were able to make it back to Spain. The engagement was so important, like Picasso's engagement with Guernica and the Mercury Fountain, that if you may allow me again, I will tell a joke, because what the hell was an American in the Spanish Republic Pavilion? Come on. They brought a very tacky fountain from Barcelona and said, we got to do something with this. And then Picasso and Miró I said, listen, why don't we speak with Sandy Calder, man? But he's American. I said, doesn't matter. Instead of saying that he's Calder, we will say that he's Calderón de la Fuente. So that's how it happened to be in the Spanish market. That was unbelievable, you know. But at the same time, when I see the lifetime engagement, not only with creativity, but also with politics, and also when I see these amazing photographs over here, we are celebrating 80 years of Guernica, 80 years of Mercury Fountain. One is in Madrid, one is in Barcelona, and this one is missing. That's one of the tragedies of my life, because for many, many years, people were trying to find where the 6 panels of Celotex were around, but nobody found them, because the anecdote said that Grandpa said, as soon as this is over, I don't want back my painting. I want to give it to the headquarters in Valencia, where the Republic site is staying. So it's shipped in a boat down to Valencia, and it has been told that since there were huge panels, I don't know, as big as this screen, they were used to make different houses to protect wounded soldiers from the rain. But what happened is that, quite remarkably, speaking about what was in Miró's mind. I mean, what is the point of doing this? He was Banksy avant la lettre. It was a graffiti, but a graffiti made by a genius, as well as we saw with Dora Maar photos of Guernica making the fantastic painting in Rue Saint-Augustin in Paris, or Calder making this fantastic Mercury Fountain, which is a jewel of engineering, poetry, and movement. These are the 3 geniuses all together in one of the most spooky times of history, 1937. Because 2 years later, the 1st of September, Hitler was going to invade Poland, and that was the most bloody war that was going to throw my continent to waste. And seeing this photo really makes me feel how aware we have to be of history and do not lose sight ever, because this can happen tomorrow again. So I have to be very aware of this history and learn about these mistakes.
You know, a lot of people talk about the similarities, the resonance between Calder and Miró, but it's maybe more fascinating to talk about their differences. Because if you look at this joy and freedom that people talk about in their work, this, again, reductionist view, which is still part of, that freedom is still part of the work, it's just not all that the work is about. But Miró internalizes that energy and then presents it as a formal communication about his anxiety of 1937. Calder doesn't do that. Calder is not dealing with his own personal anxiety. He's externalizing, he brings energy in and he pushes the energy out. He externalizes his communication, and he's about making universal communication using universal symbols, right? Simple geometry becomes a kind of hexagram that communicates something in a very essential way. But he felt that there was so much anxiety in the world that his work should not be about his own anxiety, but his work should help to elevate people in a very different approach.
Yeah, that's it.
And when we get to the constellations, these bodies of work, it's very interesting. If Miró's constellations were not called the constellations, and if Calder's constellations were not called the constellations, so Miró's constellations were named the constellations by André Breton in 1957, much later, when there was a facsimile portfolio produced. And Calder's constellations were named by Marcel Duchamp and James Johnson Sweeney, who were Calder's friends in 1943 and in advance of the show at Pierre Matisse. In fact, these bodies of work have nothing to do with each other, except they're made by very close friends who were completely separated during the war. So my point being that if you take away this name from each, which weren't even from the artists, you wouldn't start to see these bodies together. But art historians have gone and said, oh, well, Miró's constellations were made in about 1941, let's say, and Calder's constellations were made in 43. So we have this great friend, Miró, of Calder, and Calder is responding to these constellations. Art historians have actually written this, which is complete nonsense. Because one, neither of the artists saw each other's work. The very first time Miró's constellations were presented in public was 2 years after Calder's, in the same gallery in New York at Pierre Matisse, very first time. And they were called recent tempera paintings. They weren't called constellations, as I said, till 1957. So we like to go back and pull apart this oversimplification and then help people like you see all the puzzle pieces and then move forward with that. And so Jordana wrote a fantastic text for us, which about the 1937 experience, if I can call it that, for another project. And it was, and you actually delved into that all these artists were politically active. So few people write that. Why is that so fascinating for you? I told her I was going to ask her questions.
I don't think it's so fascinating. I think everyone talks about the pavilion as political, but I think it's that question of politics and form that we were talking about that I think can be really confounding. And I actually think maybe you can help me put some of the constellations up, because I think that it would be very interesting to think about that also in relation to these works from 41. Can you go forward? Oh, again?
Those are two photographs by Irving Penn. He photographed my grandfather in 47 and Miró in 48. Penn was doing a whole series of artist portraits. They're a little self-conscious, I think, but they're fun.
So let's talk a little bit about this question, because with the 37 Pavilion, I think it's scripted for us to talk about it as politically motivated art because of its location. And I think reading about the constellations, there's a lot of discussion about when these were made, right? 1941, late mid-40s. That these are works that are done where the artists are separated, but they're also each dealing with a kind of, period that is, again, fraught by war. How can we engage with these works then if we think about them as separate bodies of work, and yet we've already talked about how Miró and Calder had this, very generative friendship. So even if they weren't making them side by side, we know that they had shared creative interests. do you see these works as political, or do you see these works as really operating in a different plane, and that thinking about these works in relation to that historical moment might lead us astray to thinking about how they deal with other issues like seriality or questions of, compression or density, or, there's a lot going on in these works that we could talk about just in the realm of the work itself, right? Without going outside of the work and thinking about how they engage in the 1940s. So for you, how do you think about the Miró constellations?
For me, the Miró constellations are one of the ways to run away from destruction, from horror, from apocalypse, from war, from exile. And when you speak about what was Miró feeling when he began the constellation in 1940 in the north of France, Paul Nelson, Ben Nicholson, that went there with him, they were saying that he was totally through a process of spiritual introspectiveness, as if he was not aware of the war that was happening in Europe, as if he was high above the stars, the moon, the sun, the planets, as if his spirit had escaped the cage of flesh and the cage of bones to run above cruelty and war, to find shelter right on the sheltering sky that was protecting the planet. And when I began my research on my new book that is coming up next month in Barcelona, entitled Miró and Music, I began writing on it 20 years ago, and I interviewed Diego Masson, who is André Masson's son, and he was a music composer and a conductor of orchestras. And I said, but Diego, qu'est-ce que tu vois quand tu regardes les constellations de Joan Miró? Qu'est-ce qui se passe dans ta tête de musicien? Je vois rien. Je suis aveuglé. Je fais que rien plus qu'entendre la musique. I said, what are you saying to me? You see nothing but listening music? Yes, because I'm a musician. This is music for me. I said, what are you talking to me about? So then I made the connection about how Miró was a poetico-musical artist, because at that time he was reading poetry, he was listening Bach, he was listening Mozart, he was listening Beethoven, and he was able to really find shelter in poetry and find shelter in music. And only that inspiration, connected with the beautiful Spanish word el azar, which means chance. He was putting the paper on the table, and when he finished working with his brush in oil, he would dip it in petrol and make different compositions like that. Just letting the brush dance on the paper without thinking about the outcome. It was the irrational process of thought that was so much explained and written about by Breton, Éluard, Zara, and Michel Léris. So this is, for me, one of the most outstanding masterpieces ever created by Joan Miró. And when he wrote to Pierre Matisse, he said, Pierre, I am working on these precious jewels in a small scale that for me are like huge, large frescoes on the wall. And then when you are able to see all these extremely delicate lines with rhomboid shapes, moons, suns, women, eyes, you really understand how Miró was, as Jean Leymarie explained to me 10 years ago back in Paris, like a bird flying from life to death, from light to dark, from life to afterlife. And he was like a divine bird in a quasi-mystical introspectiveness driven to just save himself from chaos. And this is the way to really explain these extremely beautiful and joyful constellations in one of the most tragic times of European history in the past.
So interesting what you say too, because when Miró writes about working on these, right, like the extreme concentration, and he can't depart, like he can't send off anyone without having the whole suite together. And your description of it is really just amazing to try and think about that space, right, as a space that is, on the one hand, deeply impacted by the environment, but also as a space of art as being that space in which it's not even solace, right, is a simplistic way of thinking about it, but it's a kind of immersion, right, in art to kind of figure one's way out. So thank you for that. That was really an extraordinary way to think about this series.
But you know, he said quasi-mysticism, and it's not even quasi. Both of these artists are mystics. Mm-hmm. And it's something that when I talk about Calder and spirituality, not religion, of course, but spirituality and mysticism, art historians get very frustrated because they see Calder as a calculating person, which couldn't be farther from the truth.
Literal, right? A lot of times I think the mistake is seeing these.
Literal interpretation, I mean, there are objects that people read in interpretation. Sometimes a title of a work becomes so meaningful to a viewer when the title is really just like a license plate. It's like he said, titles are license plates on a car, like that. It's a way of identifying a piece on a list, on a registration. It's not to give meaning to the works. And he always titled, if he gave it a title at all, it was after the creation. So he didn't see a eucalyptus tree and those long, beautiful leaves, and then think, oh, I want to interpret that in a sculpture. He made a sculpture, and he looked at it, oh, that's kind of like eucalyptus leaves, and called it eucalyptus. It's a wonderful mobile from 1940. And if you misinterpret that, you see it as a reverse calculation, which it's not at all. So mysticism is something that, this is one of the debates I have with our biographer, Jed Pearl, who's a fantastic, he would be here tonight, but he's in Rome. He's a wonderful thinker and a great writer and doing a fantastic job, but when I bring up mysticism, he just shakes his head like, come on, that's just impractical. So I'm really glad you mentioned that. Yeah. It's so key to understanding these artists.
Do you feel like mysticism has a place in the Constellation series? Calder, in this instance, do you think that in that regard, even though they're in opposite places, they were, engaging in their art in a similar kind of immersive way?
Well, you began this discussion by asking if they were political.
Yeah.
And Calder's work is political, but it's socio-political. Mm-hmm. It's not, against some government. Yeah. They're socio-political in the sense that he invites you to interpret space in a different way. It's an invitation. Most people didn't understand the invitation and disregarded it. Right. Or you might see this as a handsome object, but you don't understand that if it hangs at 9 feet in a room, projecting straight out of the wall, as you'll all see in the exhibition tomorrow, this wonderful sculpture, it's a different way of experiencing something, and it's supposed to have you perceive your life, your circumstance in another way, which is that kind of opening of the mind is the mystical. And that's what these are entirely about. He said that these, he was thinking about some sort of cosmic nuclear gases when he made the sculptures. And then he's quoted as saying, which I won't explain. That's all he ever said about this whole body of work was that. And in my essay for the catalog, I write other quotes that he wrote about mobiles and so on, about deployed nuclei, things like that, which are relevant to this body of work. But so in a political sense, they're not overt like the Mercury Fountain or other works.
Well, that's what really even when we started talking about engagement, I think the mistake is thinking that, the work needs to be partisan or, and it's not. I think in the case of both artists' work, and especially with the Constellation series, that question of engaging the viewer, right? Breaking whatever boundary might be between the viewer in both series is really, the operation I think is a little bit different, right? Like when you were talking about, when you engage with Miro's Constellations, you're invited to move your eye into that space to kind of even, if you can, move through the paper, right? I mean, you're really asked to kind of get in that space and exist in there for a while, visually. But also, once you're there visually, your mind is there too, right? And in the Calder piece that you're talking about, it's inviting us to think about space differently. And when he pushes into our space, we get to be in his space too. And really, it's a very different kind of relationship with the work. And I think when an artist breaks down that boundary and they're engaging with the viewer, it is, we start talking about kind of the humanism of the work. It really is, I think, also operating on that level about the artist creating an avenue for dialogue, to talk, to engage, right? That it's not meant to just be a one-way street, right? So I'm wondering.
I have a question. This discussion about mysticism, I wanted to get back to that just briefly. It occurred to me that maybe reframing it outside of the scope of mysticism into a realm of metaphysics and perhaps micro and macrocosmic structures, as is talked about in music of that period, could be a way of engaging in these works in something that moves beyond a formalism into kind of spatial engagement. And I'm wondering what you think about framing things in terms of metaphysics.
My name is Griffin Rue. I'm Calder's great-grandson. And part of my studies and interest has to do with Calder and music. I'm excited by what Joan said about Miró and music and his work with that. I wrote a manuscript about Calder and sound, which is available. I can give it to you personally if you're interested. But you used the term metaphysics, which I never used in any of my own writing about Calder's relationship to composers. But I think that, it's another, you could plumb that really deeply. And mysticism is a very, very broad term. But his relationship as it relates to sonics, frequencies, sound, physics, is a huge other thing that hasn't even been brought up in this conversation about mysticism. But in terms of a metaphor for harmonic frequencies and a series of the harmonics that are available when you're looking at a disparate work of art, like all these constellations and color confrontations, form confrontations, there's a direct relationship to music, like Joan was talking about with Miró's constellations. But also sometimes, literally, in Calder's work, there is a metaphysical relationship to a sonic collision that happens in some of the sculptures. There are noise-making sculptures. I don't know if there are constellations which are actually noise-producing. I don't think that there are. But I think this is something already latent in the work, even if it's not sonically producing artwork. But that exists as well.
These two groups of work appear and then they end, like the war. Why did they end? And what did it do to the artist's work? Because the impact on us of these small, concentrated bodies of work is so intense. What do you think the impact was on the artists as these things opened and then closed?
That's a tough question to answer, Sandy.
I know, it's easy for me, it's hard for you.
With Miró, there are only 23 constellations that were from 1940 up to 1941. When you go to see them in Acquavella galleries, you will really understand the musicality joined with the extremely beautiful and poetical titles that my grandfather gave to each of them. And in Calder, only in 1943, he made 34 constellations, which is just fantastic. And when you go to see them in Acquavella, there are, in Pace Gallery, there are 38. So they were meant to be beginning in 1940 in case of Miró, and they were supposed to be ending in 1941. Only 23 constellations. And you may wonder, first of all, why 23 and not 22 or 25? Because this was an amazing enigma that I have never been able to decipher, Mark. Some things go beyond explanation, I'm sorry. Second question is, what was the impact on Miró's later work? The crystallization of this amazing work in Miró is like what happened in Pompeii, the 74 after Christ, when the volcano went in eruption. There was a huge crystallization of ice, moons, sun, planets across Miró's canvases, and always in a very mysterious blue background. And little by little, you will see how that amazing moment, for example, here, this is an amazing painting that was done by Miró in 1947 in uptown New York at the Carl Holte studio. And that's a beautiful Calder mobile, also from 47, that his grandfather gave to my grandfather as an exchange. So if you see over here, it's like the big continuation of the same magma, of the same ground-breaking strata of an earthquake that really is catapultating all that vibration that make a sonic explosion provoked by the big collision of these 23 poetico-musical masterpieces in Miró's career. So there is a Miró before the constellations, and there's a Miró after the constellations. No doubt about that. And now, Sandy, it's your turn.
I don't have a heartfelt. I'm good. Last week, the New York Times reporter asked me, how many constellations by Calder are there? And there's no definitive answer on that, because the number of works that were shown by Pierre Matisse in 1943 at that first show of the constellations, there were some other works in the show that weren't constellations, weren't made out of carved wood, and weren't on the wall. They were these other objects. And so they didn't really belong in that show, but do you include those in your count? Do you not include those? And then he made some works in 1944, and some works in 1945, and one in 49, and all the way up to 1960, he made constellations occasionally. The ones which are after 1943 are less effective, in my opinion, than the ones that are concentrated from 43, the original body of them. And you can see kind of how they developed if you study a few works in 42. So Jordana was asking about how did they begin. They began like this. The war is on. Calder is struggling with materiality. He goes back to what he was doing in 35 and 36, which is carving precious, beautiful pieces of wood, choosing the wood for its grain, for its character, for its color. And he takes his own sculpture about this tall called The Crowd, which is a bunch of figures that he made in 1928 or 29 of these figures crowding in. It's a powerfully old-fashioned sculpture, but it's made out of this beautiful block of ebony. And he decides to saw it in half and bust it with an axe into chunks. why he didn't saw it into pieces is because he wanted to expose the curly grain of the wood and use that characteristic in works in 1942. So there are a few works that occurred before the pre-Constellations, we think of them. There's one in the show, which is a hanging mobile with yellow rods. Look for the hanging mobile with yellow rods. You see these carved wooden objects all suspended down on these 4 lines of green string. And it's actually not a constellation technically, but it's like a constellation. So it's a precursor to the constellations. That's why it's in the show. And then there are a few later ones in the show to show the diversity. But depending how you count, we don't have a definitive number. And he continued to work on that sort of, so he struggled with trying to channel that energy that he had. He loved these constellations that he made in 1943, and he would go back occasionally and feel that moment and put together carved wood objects and create another sculpture, but I don't think they were as effective as the first ones.